Good day, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I'm your host, the voice of reason. In this episode, I'm going to look at a hypothetical conflict between the armed forces of Egypt and the armed forces of Turkey. And what I'll also do is remove any thought that NATO would intervene on the behalf of the Turkish armed forces. This is strictly looking at the capabilities of Turkey versus Egypt. And first, we'll have a brief look at the two forces, not too in deep, but just a brief overview. Obviously, the Egyptians go back in terms of its military history, many hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. We've seen Egypt under the occupation of the British Army. So we have seen inside of the Egyptian armed forces the role that the British Army has played. We see the role that even the Ottoman Army has played, and to even some of the most recent activities, such as the Soviet Union and the United States, with the Bright Star operations that have taken place inside of, and in Egypt. But in terms of overall capability, obviously Egypt possesses a very large air force. It has recently obtained Rafale multi-role fighter aircraft from France. It also possesses F-16s. It possesses the Su-35, which they are purchasing from the Russians, MiG-29s, MiG-21. So really a wide range of aircraft. And that is not always a wise choice to have that many types of aircraft in service from that many different nations, as you have to maintain supply chains, you have to maintain maintenance on those aircraft, and the pilots have to be familiar with the different types of aircraft. But with that being said, at the same time, some of these technologies, especially the F-16s, are a little bit handicapped. The United States, unfortunately for the Egyptians, did not give the Egyptians some of the most advanced radars that existed on the F-16s. They also did not give the Egyptians some of the more higher end, beyond visual range radar guided missiles, such as the AMRAAM, that the Turkish armed forces, in fact, possess. Now, that has been rectified a little bit with the recent acquisition of the Rafale aircraft and those systems that the French have included on that aircraft. But at the same time, that is really not going to offset the technology penalty that the Egyptians would incur against the Turkish armed forces. The the Egyptian army is very large, hundreds of thousands of soldiers, thousands of tanks. They possess basically a monkeyed version of the M1A1. It doesn't have the depleted uranium armor, but are still very effective systems in their own right, and are very comparable and could defeat any system right now deployed by the Turkish army themselves. The defense budget, very, very important. How much money is a nation state spending on its military? And I believe the current defense budget for Egypt is around $11 billion. So, again, very good capabilities. I think the Egyptians really get a bad rap at times for their performance in the 1973 and really all the Arab-Israeli wars. But you really have to look at some of the successes that did occur, such as in the 73 war. The Egyptians were able to cross the Suez Canal that was being actively defended by the Israeli army, and they were able to cross in force. However, because of some of the politicizing that occurs inside of the Egyptian army and some of the training or lack of training, they were not able to prosecute that effort to its full extent. And we have seen some of those deficiencies also rear their ugly head, such as in the 1991 retaking of Kuwait by the coalition of forces. And there was one specific event that occurred in the 91 Gulf War in which United States forces actually had to contact Hosni Mubarak to get the divisional commander of the Egyptian forces that were being utilized in the Allied coalition against Iraq to actually move his forces in a more aggressive manner. And again, this is some of the political issues that are inside of the Egyptian army that have really hampered the force. Now, we hear that has been limited, and they are changing some of those policies and procedures that existed inside of the Egyptian army that really hampered the Egyptian army in some of those conflicts. Now, if we look at the Turkish military, they have benefited greatly from being part of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. More importantly, they have been on the side of technology sharing that has greatly helped them expand their defense industry. And their military spending is actually greater than the Egyptian armed forces, I believe around $17 billion. So 5 to 6 billion more is spent by the Turks than the Egyptians. But again, Air Force, very capable. They produce many of their own systems, or have the ability to produce many of their own systems. They have actually worked close with the Israeli defense industry to produce some of these systems. A lot of this occurred prior to Erdogan and the current political regime inside of Turkey. The Turkish armed forces have also been hampered by some near recent events. Such as the Turkish coup d'état that took place. A lot of good leaders were lost, and as were many Air Force pilots as well. And that has caused issues and challenges inside of the Turkish armed forces. However, with that being said, the Turks seem to have been able to overcome some of those challenges and many of those challenges, and continue to field a fairly capable force that continues to this day to benefit from technology sharing by the West and NATO, which has already occurred and still does occur to some extent. And then obviously training. Training is very important, and the Turkish forces are able to train quite a bit with NATO forces, as they are part of NATO. And but what would a conflict look like? What would an actual war look like between Egypt and Turkey? Well, the real issue is that they don't share a common land border. So any conflict that would occur between the Turkey and Egypt would either be over a conflict that would take place inside and around the Mediterranean. This would be mainly a naval conflict with elements of the Air Force intervening as well. And under that condition, under just looking at it strictly from a naval and air campaign someplace in the Mediterranean between the two nation states, the Egyptians would probably end up on the bad end of that conflict. And I think, given the level of training and technology and force structure and the aircraft and the naval assets that the Turks possess, they would be able to drive the Egyptian forces out of the Mediterranean Sea and into the near waters of Egypt. Now, with that being said, any other conflict between Egypt and Turkey would probably take place in Libya. And as we know, the Turks are supporting the Tripoli-led government, And right now, the Egyptians support the Benghazi-led government, and these are two sides are fighting basically a civil war. And Egypt supports one side, and the Turks support the other side. Now, if we were to see that heat up, and we could see possibly major forces from Turkey being moved into Libya, could we see a fairly significant ground conflict between the forces of Turkey and Egypt? And I would say, yeah, that is a possibility. It could occur. Under that scenario, I believe that because Egypt shares the border, has a land route into Libya, they would be able to marshal enough forces to basically overrun the Turkish forces. Now, granted, we would see the Egyptians take some rather significant casualties because of the technology that the Turks possess, especially with the drone capability that Turkish forces currently possess and are continuing to modernize and advance. That would be a thorn in the Egyptian side. Now, with that being said, I believe the Egyptians would do a better job of negating that drone threat than we've seen in other recent conflicts, such as the Azeris versus the Armenians. The Armenians were not able to negate and stop the Turkish slash Azeri drone threat. The Egyptians would be able to mitigate that to some extent, so it wouldn't be as a potent of a threat to the Egyptian forces. But in the end, I do believe the Egyptians would be able to marshal multiple divisions with a lot of heavy armor and advance down the coastal highway, engage, and eventually defeat the forces of Turkey that may have been deployed inside of Libya. But again, as long as the Egyptian forces have addressed some of those doctrine issues, just an example in the past, and we've heard that has been alleviated. We don't see it anymore in terms inside of the Egyptian army. But when it comes to training and wargaming, many of these war games have already been planned out, and we already know the winner ahead of time. So we don't really get to see uh, really good aggressive commanders coming out of those Egyptian formations that operated under that training regime. So if that has changed, and they are really looking at non-politicizing the armed forces and getting good, aggressive battlefield commanders that are not jockeying for political position, and they're there as war fighters, then I would say the Egyptian military would probably be on a better foot than it was during the engagements with the Israelis in past campaigns. That was a huge issue. It was a doctrine issue. It was a lot of that also was part of the Soviet doctrine that existed for a long time inside of the Egyptian military, and that obviously now has changed. A lot of the equipment now is Western equipment inside the Egyptian military, and the Egyptian military does work more closely with the United States, obviously, in the many years past. But that still hasn't always resulted in great aggressive battlefield commanders, as we saw in 1991 when the Egyptians deployed to fight against the Iraqis. And we just saw that lack of initiative raise its ugly head. And, and I'm not 100% certain that has been taken out of that force structure. But again, just in terms of population, in terms of size of military forces, because they border Libya, they would, I believe, be able to simply exert enough combat power against any forces that were deployed by the Turkish military inside of Libya, and eventually they would be able to wear down the Turkish forces and defeat them on the battlefield. So the Egyptians get a win in Egypt. However, in engagements in the and over the Mediterranean, the Turkish forces would most certainly win those engagements. I hope that gives some insight and gives some perspective. Have a great day, everyone.